Right, good morning, everybody. My name is Gail Day. I am the Executive Manager at the Free Market Foundation. Today we are launching the fourth in a series of 8 booklets titled Laws Affecting Small Business. The series was first published by the FMF in the late 1990s. As red tape unfortunately continues to undermine business, we've updated the series, which deals with finance, health, justice, labor, land, licensing, schooling, and tax. Michael Bagraim has been practicing labor law since 1986. He will be presenting labor today. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me again. I was involved in that first booklet on labor, and we had lots of fun putting that together. And although I didn't put this current update together, obviously I agree with everything that contained herein. I'm not sure if everyone's had a chance to have a look at the booklet, but if not, it's really worth reading. If I can just quickly go into a little bit of the history and possibly the politics of this. You will understand that during apartheid, it was difficult for trade unions to organize. It was almost impossible to invoke rights, employees' rights. And of course, as we came out into a democracy, and thank God for that, it became quite clear that the real issue is the negotiation between big business, the big trade unions, umbrella bodies of the trade unions, and of course, governments, and hence the formation of NEDLAC, which is just that. It's the negotiation of the big players. And of course, what it's done is it's invoked basically the laws, the labor laws that big business would like to see. It almost destroys small business. And what's been put together over here by the Free Market Foundation, and well done to them for this, is that they've put together a couple of ideas as to what can be argued, what can be pushed, and how we can try somehow and influence the future discussions at NEDLAC. And in fact, it's now an opportune moment because NEDLAC is right now debating, I think they're actually in one of those debates today, they're debating the updating of our labor laws to try somehow and include the unemployed. And that's the problem. Let's just quickly have a look at that. I think the current figures are we're about 11 million unemployed South Africans on the expanded definition of people who could go into the workplace or are able to go into the workplace and either given up looking or still looking. So it's about 11 million people. We're close on 40%, but what's even more horrific in South Africa today, and you know the bulge is people below the age of 25, well, when you look at the figures of the ages 16 to 25, we're almost at 70% unemployment in South Africa. And it can't be business as usual. It just cannot be. So well done to the FMF for putting together not only a synopsis, but some really good ideas. So the first thing is when you obviously need to have a look at which business is actually creating jobs around the world. And the economists are in agreement on this. And in fact, even the South African government is in agreement on this, in that the job creation now and for the next foreseeable future is in small business. That's businesses, if you're looking at most definitions, probably less than 100 employees. They're the people that are creating jobs, if at all. Every quarter in South Africa for the last 10 years, we've gone down. And what is it? What is holding back small business? And what is holding back job creation in South Africa? And that's what the Free Market Foundation's had a look at. And the first thing, obviously, is not to couple small business with big business. So we've got the bargaining councils, the old industrial councils, the bargaining councils, obviously are extending their agreements to include small business. And of course, big business is going to crowd out small business completely. And the reality is right now is that small business is creating some of the employment, but the small businesses that seem to be thriving are avoiding the labour laws altogether. We don't have a great inspectorate in this country. We don't have the ability to oversee most of the small businesses, in particular in the previously disadvantaged areas. Small businesses are starting to grow, and they're surviving, but they're not thriving. And we need to ensure that they are not bound by the same laws. So you would find Anglo-America being bound by some of our labour laws, and the spas are shot by the same labour laws. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And of course, we're seeing all around the world, we're seeing differentiation when it comes to big and small business. It doesn't help to have, for instance, a minimum wage, when in fact the real minimum wage in South Africa is 0 rands per month. That's the real minimum wage in South Africa, because people are just not getting anywhere. In fact, if you look at today's Business Day, there's an interesting article, I can't remember who the fellow was, but he's writing on behalf of the unemployed, condemning the minimum wage. And he's quite right. If we're going to have that harsh, onerous regulatory authority of our labour law, and especially when it's looking at small business, you're just never going to get off the starting blocks. And so have a look at how can a small business, look at it from a completely external point of view. You're not a small business owner, look at it from an external point of view. What is it that's holding them back? And there's a couple of things, obviously, finance, etc., etc. But which small business person would want to manufacture a pair of jeans in the shadow of Table Mountain when you're governed by the Bargaining Council, you're governed by all our labour legislation, and at the end of the day, you've got an inspector on your back? And I don't envy anyone who tries to manufacture that. It's so much cheaper just to bring it in from India. And then, of course, we've got no job creation at all. I want to have a look at the section on employment for the unemployable. Now, who takes in the unemployable? I try to use an example of when I was in Standard 9, was grade 11 at school. I wanted some more pocket money. I went down to our local Spur restaurant and I asked if I could have a job. I was under 18 and it was difficult to employ people under 18. But in those days, I could go in, walk down there and say, I'd have a job. And they said, no, we've got no job available for you. My answer to them was, well, that's fine, you don't need to pay me. I'll live on tips. I'll be good enough to encourage people to pay me some tips and just give me a chance. And of course, that's what happened. They said, sure, here's an overall, here's your bottle opener, and go ahead. No training, no ability to do what I had to do. And of course, what happens is I started working. And yes, I did earn good tips. And yes, I try and be as pleasant as possible. I think I was reasonably quick to bring people their food. And I managed to get it. Now, if you tried that today, it would be absolutely impossible. And that's what's happening in our labour today. You can't go into a Spur restaurant and say, I'll work for nothing. I'll work for my tips. You can't do it. Rather let Michael Bagraim starve. Let him stand outside saying, I wish I could get a job there. I've got no training. And that's what's calling now for the employing the unemployable. I don't have a CV. I don't have a background. I don't have training. I've got nothing. How do I get in? And the only way I'm going to get in is into a small business. And the small business has to take a chance. And invariably, at the moment, you're forcing them to break the law because they can't afford to pay me a minimum wage. They can't afford to give me the hours that I need in terms of most of the legislation. They can't. They say to me, well, you've come in and work for 2 hours. Well, they're still going to pay me for 4 hours in terms of the minimum wage. It doesn't work. And the only way we're going to do that is by giving some sort of exemption to the small businesses. I also believe that the Department of Labour needs to re-educate the inspectors to have a look at the situation with the jaundiced eye, have a look at the situation at the moment and say, let's not pick on the small business. Let's go and look at big businesses. They're the people that can afford all the fancy legislation, and let those people, at the end of the day, concentrate there. Yes, obviously if a small business is breaching some of the basic conditions of Employment Act, especially with regard to health, then I would understand. But then you need to rely on the staff coming forward. And of course, trade unions ought to also have a look at it and need to re-understand. And I obviously speak to trade unions every day. I speak to trade union officials every single day. And I think the message is getting through to them. They are saying to me that we don't need to come down so harshly on small businesses. Don't retrench. I'm hearing the story now every day. Don't retrench. We understand that you won't be able to pay the full wage in terms of this bargaining council agreement, but let's turn a blind eye to it. And I'm getting that from the trade unions more so than I'm hearing it from big business, which is quite strange. So in terms of the recommendations, you'll see under recommendation 2 is recognise the right of small employers to freedom of association as well as disassociation by exempting them from the provisions of the Labour Relations Act. Now, I'm not calling for a wholesale throw-out of the Labour Relations Act. I'm looking for exemptions. And I'm looking for people to be able to look at those exemptions, not from the point of view of government, from the point of view of business. And so what we need to do is restructure all those exemption type committees. There are lots of them, and it's not so easy to, at the end of the day, to actually divorce yourself as a committee member on a bargaining council. Very difficult to divorce yourself from the rights of the bargaining council as opposed to what is good for the economy. And it's a real problem. One of the issues, a bit more complicated, is the burden of proof. Let me quickly explain that. And whoever's going to stop me when I've spoken too long, please do so. But if I'm going to accuse someone of assaulting me in the criminal law, I need to go to the police station and take evidence that I've been assaulted. I'm making the allegation. He who alleges must prove. That's common law, law all around the world. I would then bring my evidence. I would show that I've got a police report. I would show some witnesses. I show a medical report, etc., and I'll be able to prove that I've been assaulted. It's completely the other way around when it comes to employment. If I, as a small business owner, dismiss Joe Soap, Joe Soap will go to the CCMA, the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration, and at the CCMA, he'll say he's been unfairly dismissed. It's a bold statement, and that's all he'll say. Doesn't have to put much more in his application, his 711 application. It then is for the employer to come forward and prove that it was a fair dismissal. Now, you don't really know why the employee is saying that it's unfair, but you've got to hold that shire and you've got to prove it. So you've been brought there to the CCMA to answer a case that you don't know much about, and you will need to then go and prove it. So they've twisted the whole burden of proof, the onus the lawyers talk about, they've twisted it in favor of the employee. And I can understand that in terms of the history of South Africa, where the employee had no power and it was very difficult. And now what they try to do is swing the pendulum completely the other way. But it's a difficult one. Give you a quick example. I landed up at the Building Industry Bargaining Council just before COVID. And there was an allegation by a group of people, my client being a rather large builder, a group of people had arrived and said they'd been unfairly dismissed. My client said to me, will you help us out, defend us? But we don't know these people. We don't know who they are. We've never employed them. And of course, you have to try and twist the burden of proof back to the employee at that point to say, you've got to first prove employment. It became absolutely clear in that particular case, after about 2 hours of arguing, and arguing, in fact, with the commissioner at the same time, to show that they were, in fact, working for a subcontractor who had then dismissed them, and not the main contractor who was my client. And because their board was up on the site, the employees of the subcontractor thought they were employed by the contractor. Now, that was after wasting a morning and spending one hell of a lot of money on Bagraim's attorneys and wasting a lot of time on the whole human resource team of a massive company coming to sit there and saying, we don't even know these people. So you can see the problem in our law, and simply resolved. That should be simply resolved. We should be able to say, let's shift the burden. It's a regulatory thing. It's not legislation. It's pure regulations. And then, of course, we've got a whole lot of other issues. And we're talking about in recommendation 4, where it says one of the greatest problems facing small businesses is the necessity to keep proper records. Well, you can imagine if you're running a small business, how difficult that is. Often you've got people who are taking the chance, don't have money, open a small business, have no education, and have no facilities and no time. You often hear from small business people, I'm too busy to get organized. Now, if you're not going to keep the records, you're going to be facing a fine, and you'll probably close down. An anecdotal story happened to me a few years ago. I retrenched a fellow from a rather large business and gave him a decent payout, severance payout, which was fine. He then went away and I didn't hear from him again. About 2 years later, just before COVID, he then telephones me and says he's got real problems. I said, yes. He said, do you remember me? I didn't remember him. He then explained to me when we had met. I then recognized the fellow and I said, well, tell me what's the issue. And he said he took his small package that he got when he got retrenched and he opened up a small mechanical workshop in a township just outside Cape Town called Khayelitsha. I said, that's innovative, well done. He said, yes, and he built it up where he's been able to employ 5 of his friends, people who live nearby. And he's built his business in the sense that he's got 5 friends working for him, so it's feeding 6 families, and they're doing reasonably well. He had to dismiss someone, one of his colleagues, who was taking a drug called TIC and was misbehaving, and it wasn't working, and he had to dismiss him. This fellow went to the bargaining council. The bargaining council arrived at his workshop, said, you're not registered, you haven't paid the various levies that you need to pay, and issued a fine to him, not for the unfair dismissal. That hadn't been argued, but he had a fine of just over 39,000 rand. Now you can imagine if the man, after paying his salaries and his overheads, is making 3,000 or 4,000 rand a month as profit, and he had to pay that. He said if he has to pay that, he's got to sell all his tools and he's finished. That's the end of his business, and everyone loses their job. And this is what the system has done to this fellow. I gave him some illegal advice. I don't even mind telling you on this. I said, well, it's quite simple. If you want to hear what Michael Bagraim would do, not what attorney Bagraim would do, I close down my business, take your tools, move a shack 2 kilometers to the south, and start up again with another name, which is what he did. He's doing very well now, and now he's registered with the Bargaining Council because now he's doing quite well, and you can afford to actually regularize it. The point being that he would never have got off the ground. The system is bad. It can't be like that. Why is everyone going to face that same particular problem in South Africa? I've spoken a bit about the extension of the agreements. The sectorial determinations, again, is a problem because the sectorial determinations are treating everyone in the same boat. There's no oversight from a regulatory authority on the statutory councils to understand business. There just isn't any understanding at all. And it is about time that the Labour Ministry has a look at this carefully. Now, again, I know that NEDLAC are debating this very issue. I have been nagging this for a long time and have been desperate to try and say, let's have a look at the regulations vis-a-vis the type of business that we're going into and how big it is, how much they can afford, and how can they stand on their own 2 feet. What can we do as a government to have a look at how we can actually assist the business to stand on its own 2 feet? Well, we've got a bigger problem. And the bigger problem is, what is an employee? What is that animal called an employee? And this is a problem that's been affecting us for years. And the problem is getting worse. And you've probably all heard about the debates about Uber or about Airbnb. Who employs these people? Airbnb clearly can't employ the lady that cleans the flat that has been rented out through the Airbnb platform. Now, our regulations are moving very swiftly towards an understanding of that lady who cleans the apartment, which is owned by someone else and regulated by Airbnb, that Airbnb employs the lady who cleans. Because that's the way we're going to have our definition very soon in South Africa. We're seeing around the world the attack on Uber, where you got Joseph owns 5 motor vehicles, and he's attached to the platform, the Uber platform, and he employs 5 drivers for those 5 motor vehicles. At the moment, there's confusion in terms of the regulations as to who actually employs the drivers. Now, it's clear from a practical point of view and from a physical point of view that it's the owner of the motor vehicles that employs the driver and not the Uber platform. But let's take the owner driver. The owner driver then goes onto the platform of Uber and then claims that he's working overtime. Who pays him for that overtime? And this is going to be a problem in South Africa in the very near future. It's getting worse. We're basically going to see problems where we're going to start attacking these virtual platforms, and that's the future of business in South Africa. There are a lot of sections. We've got recommendations with regard to strikes. The recommendation 8 is an interesting one. The section 777, Labour Relations Act, which says that every employee who is not engaged in essential service or may take part in a partial or complete concerted refusal to work or the retardation or obstruction of work for the purposes of promoting or defending the economic interests of others. Now, who has to pay these people? Are they being paid? At the moment, it is a bit of a problem. Most large businesses obviously can absorb those costs, but small business can't. And we're going to see a fallout over there where certain businesses should be able to be exempt. I don't believe that any of the businesses are actually paying people who are going on these strikes. And of course, the trade unions don't have their own funds to pay. But the reality is that small business is suffering from this, and they should be exempt from that. There's another very interesting recommendation, and that's the litigation part. As you probably might know, there's a beautiful red carpet inviting every employee in the country into the CCMA portals. That red carpet is well known to almost every employee in South Africa. That red carpet is very inviting. I accused the commissioner last week of we should change the name from the CCMA to ATM, because I strongly believe that people are, to a large degree, setting up their employers. So you work for a month or two, you create a bit of havoc, you go to the CCMA, and invariably small businesses can't afford to go and litigate. They can't afford to be there. They don't know the rules and regulations. They don't have the time for this. Take the small corner cafe making hamburgers every day. They can't go and stand down at the CCMA, go for a conciliation or arbitration. It's so much cheaper just to say, all right, here's 2 or 3 months' salary, leave me alone, and let's get out of there. And that's the norm. I know I'm one of the culprits in the system for that. And we should have a shortened form of being able to do this. In fact, now COVID, and COVID's been good in certain respects. COVID has been quite good in that a lot of the small businesses are getting used to going onto the Zoom platform and managing to run their arbitrations and their conciliations on the Zoom platform. Now, there is a suggestion as well that if people are earning very high salaries, say over 60,000 Rand a month, I'm not sure what figure they're going to put on it, but it's being debated, that they won't have access to the CCMA. But there's another suggestion coming out of the Free Market Foundation, and that is to set a ceiling of 2 months' salary on compensation that may be awarded in terms of Section 194 against small employers in the event of finding against the employer. In other words, you won't have a train smash. Let's say you don't go through any type of hearing because you don't have the ability to do it. You don't have the background. You don't have the wherewithal to run a fancy disciplinary hearing and to spend time and to make a decision and get an independent chair, etc., etc. Where does a small business do that? They can't. And invariably, they then land up the CCMA, spend a lot of time there, and sometimes either reinstate the people through the CCMA, or what happens is we're finding that we've got exorbitant sums. We give someone 12 months' salary because you've not been through a proper procedural dismissal. And again, there should be this recommendation, should be taken to heart. And again, this is something that we need to put forward to NEDLAC and see what we can do on this. There have been other suggestions also in terms of recommendation 11 on labour brokers. It's an interesting debate, and the whole world is turning to the labour broker type system. South Africa, unfortunately, is still trying its utmost to destroy the system, to actually tell people if you're earning under the threshold and you're working for 3 months for a labour broker, but you've been placed elsewhere, you now have the law where it says you actually got a chance to sue or take to the CCMA the client as opposed to the labour broker. Again, it's creating havoc in the business world. Now, I think I've reached my 15 minutes and I'm happy to answer any questions unless I can carry on. I've only gone through some of the recommendations. But Gail, are you around? Are you listening?
Michael, thank you very much indeed. I think that was wonderful, and perhaps we will allow people to get a link to the booklet and then they can look at some of the other issues a little later. But perhaps for now we can see if there are any questions. If anybody has a question that they'd like to ask verbally, just pop up your hand and we can and obviously unmute yourself. And otherwise, my colleague Zags is going to read out any chat questions for you. I see he's got his hand up. Zags?
Hi, good. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Thank you. So, when talking about labor legislation specifically, do you think there's a particular industry that, deserves the most attention? As you mentioned, we have high unemployment numbers, so maybe low-skilled industries are the ones that deserve, specific focus in terms of deregulating the labor law.
I didn't catch that entirely, Gail. Can you?
Zags was asking if there's a particular entity that one should focus on to kind of exempt from labor law that would make a difference to the unemployed.
Well, yes, obviously the first thing we need to do, and I mean, I'm trying it every day, and that's working with the department to try and tighten up or loosen their regulations, because that's quick and easy. It's quick and easy to loosen up regulations as opposed to changing law. And then, of course, the other entity that I keep talking about is NEDLAC, because there it is a forward-thinking body. Unfortunately, NEDLAC is still a talk shop, because when agreements are reached at NEDLAC, often government reneges on the agreement. And so I have a particular problem with that, but we need to keep pushing. that is a forward-thinking body, and they are at the moment looking at all our labor, the overall labor laws. So that there's some very interesting discussions that are taking place. And of course, one of the discussions is with regard to small business and the exemption of small business.
Thank you. I see, Terry, you have your hand up.
Michael, thank you very much for that. Your little story of the chap who was charged 39,000 Rand because he wasn't registered and so on. To what extent is that an exception rather than the rule? I mean, I was having a discussion with somebody the other day and talking about, removing all this legislation. He said, but don't worry, small business just ignores it and just carries on regardless. So, I mean, I know that we would all agree that maybe the law shouldn't be there or whatever, but can you sort of quantify? Does it have an impact on 1% or 5% or 90% of people?
No, I suspect it only has an effect on 1%, because you're quite right. We're forcing small businesses in South Africa who want to thrive, not just survive, we're forcing them to break the law. Now, when you're speaking to a fellow who wants to put some cash investment into a small business, and you say to him, I know that you've got your retirement monies, and say 2 million Rand, and you've got a skill, set up a small business and go for it. And that fellow is going to look at the whole environment and say, I'm not prepared to risk my money, my investment, and then break the law and then have a possibility of being caught. So it's not the percentage. It's the people who actually do have the money to invest are saying, I'm not going to invest. And I'm not going to do this because of the risk. Now, you can explain to the count somehow that the risk is minimal, and it is. You're quite right. The risk is minimal. We have very few inspectors in South Africa. I think we have less than 2,000 inspectors from the department. And so the risk of an inspector getting to you is absolutely minimal. But if you're going to put your own hard-earned cash into the business and you say, I'm going to start off on a negative, on an illegal basis, I'd rather not do it. And so we've got the well-known phenomenon in South Africa, it's in a few other countries as well, but the well-known phenomenon where small business is on an investment strike. Skills, but also the finance to be able to take in 20, 30 people. Now, if we had 500,000 small businesses, and there must be more than 500,000 of those that have the money to invest and won't, but if all of them did invest, saying, well, we're going to be left alone, maybe for the first 5 years, or something of that nature, we're going to be left alone, we'll employ 30 people each, we'll almost cure our unemployment problem overnight. So that's where I'm coming from. You're quite right. Most small businesses who are survivalist businesses are quite happy just to ignore the law completely. And that's what I advise this fellow that I was speaking to. But
it sounds like it's a case of the seen and the unseen. You don't see the people who are not investing. You can't quantify it.
Of course not. But I deal with them all day, and I'm sure you do as well. When people say, I've got the money, but it's much easier to keep it in stock exchange in Mauritius.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Terry. Grant, just before I come to you, I'd like to pop in a question of my own. I'm assuming, Michael, there's quite a lot of opportunity for corruption in this sort of environment.
Absolutely. It's so much cheaper to pay an inspector than to pay a fine.
And that's worrying. All right, Grant has his hand up. Grant.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Michael. Has anyone paid attention to the ability of, or the right that bargaining councils have to appoint their own arbitrators to apply and enforce the collective agreements? Because that's a massive problem, where the bargaining council will pay a commissioner to come and sit there and hear their cases, who come out with the most ridiculous awards and rulings, in order to make their client, the bargaining council, happy. And you have to go to the Labour Court to have that set aside or taken on review. It would be much better if, for example, the CCMA was the only place where bargaining council agreements were enforced. Yeah, that is a huge issue. It needs to be paid attention to. It would be the same as if Woolworths would hire a magistrate to come and sit there at the offices and do Section 65 bad debt reviews on all their account holders that aren't paying.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and there's been a complaint for years. In fact, since the inception of the new bargaining council system, people have been complaining. And again, it's pure regulations. It's not even law. So you could get, if we had a decent minister, not a communist, but if we had a decent minister of employment and labour, and have a look at it, it doesn't help for 5 wolves and a sheep to sit around the table and then have a vote as to what to have for lunch. That's not gonna fly. And unfortunately, you're quite right. That's exactly what's happening. The wolves are having a vote what to have for lunch.
Thank you, Michael. Are there any other questions? See, Grant's given you a thumbs up.
I can see Grant's been bitten.
Anybody else like to engage at this stage? If not, Michael, I'm going to say thank you very much indeed.
Sorry, Gail, I just want to ask one more
Sure.
comment. To what extent, and I think it has been discussed, but to what extent could one raise a constitutional challenge against labour legislation? Insofar as, and I don't know my constitution all that well, but insofar as I wanted to get a job and there's a law that stops me from getting a job, is there not some sort of part of the constitution that says this is not constitutional?
That's actually been challenged over the years. First of all, it takes you 10, 15 years to get to the Constitutional Court on a point like that. Second of all, it would cost you millions. And we've been losing all the time. The Constitution says we must have fair labour practice, and it's basically been skewed in favour of collective bargaining. The whole system is built on collective bargaining, which I think is unfair at the end of the day, because then it's a majority decides for the minority. But that's the way our Constitution has looked at it. Constitutional courts have always looked at the law and from that basis. So no, I don't think that's the right way to do it. What we need to do, and at least government is now recognizing a couple of things. The first thing they've recognized is that it can't be business as usual. So at least we're getting that from people across the board. Maybe not the Labour Minister himself, but I think I'm hearing that from the ANC itself. So if it can't be business as usual, then what must it be? And that's what's being debated right now. It's the first, it's been an eye-opener for me, but it's the first time I've seen issues that we've raised now by the Free Market Foundation, and I'll be feeding a lot of this into NEDLAC. It's the first time in years that I've seen real issues being debated of this nature.
Thanks.
That's very good to hear, Michael, and we'll keep in touch on this and the other 7 booklets where there are other issues that have a similar impact, of course, on small business. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and particularly to Michael for speaking. And this video will be made available on our YouTube channel, and you will also be able to access this booklet and the other 3 that have been launched to date, and the others will be launched every week until the end of November. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for inviting me.
Bye-bye.